Okay, I'm just going to come in here with a quick question here on regulation, because as an economist I have done a project in the past on the economic impact of European regulation, environmental regulation on companies, and it actually drove up the productivity. So I'm going to say the Leave campaigners focus very much on the fact that regulation is a major problem with the EU, but regulations on environmental standards, workers' protections, and even financial regulations, we all know we don't want to go back to light touch regulation in certain areas. They're there to protect people and they're there to protect the environment. While Europe has a reputation of over-regulating in certain areas, would the panel agree that it is better to be in there and shape the direction of the regulation in Europe rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater? So I'll let you, John, come back on that.
Well, that's clearly the case, and I would say that one of the problems of this 25-year-long campaign that we've had against British membership of the European Union is that it has severely damaged our capacity to influence the European Union. Basically, Britain joined. We were in a relatively weak economic position when we did. We then had a whole range of reforms in the 80s and 90s which transformed the British economy. And after that, we then sort of got bored with getting engaged in the European process. And Britain's influence in shaping European regulations has actually been lamentable compared to the Germans, the French. I mean, in my own area of financial services, I mean, if you compare Britain's position in financial services, we should have as dominant an influence in setting the regulations in the EU as the Germans have over the regulations in the car industry, for example. And I think this is a political failure of the British establishment, of all parties, actually. Now, the idea that you can have access to a regulatory arrangement that you do not shape in services is, in my view, completely mad. If the EU will be, along with the US, setting the terms of the regulation of the markets that I deal in. On the outside of that process, we will be a taker. We will have no influence. And both the Americans and our continental ex-partners will be determined to get the maximum advantage from that. And that can only add up to one thing: extremely bad news for the City of London, which is a very significant provider of UK GDP.
Okay. Owen, would you like to come back? Do you see any benefits to the regulation at all?
Well, massively, absolutely. I mean, you asked about the environment. I mean, we are still signatories to the really big international conventions, so that's Bern, Ramsar, Aarhus. That carries on. But the problem is the manner in which these are interpreted at EU level, in which I was very, very closely involved. And we had a case when I was the Secretary of State at DEFRA. It was a controversy about a pesticide, which my chief scientific advisor said categorically did not do damage to bee populations, and we were one of the very few countries in Europe that had done real trials with real bees in real fields, unlike some lab tests which my scientific advice said were rigged against the particular pesticide. And we had allies. I did exactly what John would like to have done. I got an alliance. We had people like the Hungarians, who had 2 million hectares using this material, and a very significant honey industry. They produced 20,000 tons of honey, as opposed to 25,000 in the UK. So we created a significant block of opinion, but there was a massive campaign, what I describe as the Green Blob. I had 85,000 emails to my personal parliamentary email account. And so did the commissioner. And he was a really nice guy. He was an ex-Maltese Conservative foreign minister, one of the rare people remembered fondly going to Blackpool for the Conservative conference. And he said to me, I said, what you should do is do what we've done. You should continue with more field trials and extend them, and then come back in, I think we said 3 years' time. He said, okay, I've got to do something. I've got to do something. And there was an arbitrary decision overruling us. They didn't have a majority to push this through, but nor did we have a majority to properly block, and this was rammed through without any thought of the alternatives. And what's happened is we've fallen back on really horrible older alternatives, probably created in the 1950s, 1960s, things like pyrethroids, terrible for the aquatic environment, carbamates, we've seen a significant drop-off in yield, we've seen a significant drop-off in plantings of some of the crops affected. Now, that is what happens when you pool sovereignty.
Okay. Oh,
We were not allowed to follow technology, we were not allowed to follow scientific advice, and we were overruled
Oh, and I'm just
with
gonna
real damage to our environment.
Okay, just going to let Vernon come in very quickly on this because I think we have to go to
Yeah,
the
we're going
audience
to
for
go.
Q&A
We're going to go
as well.
to an audience Q&A
Yeah.
just after Vernon's
Okay, all right, thank you.
speaks.
Just on the regulation, the question was about has regulation had any benefits? And I mean, obviously, if you're in a single market, you do have to have regulation. And part of the way in which I think Europe helped is if you look at the social Europe aspects of the question around paternity rights, maternity rights, workers' rights. I think there were big benefits that accrued to us as a result of that, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. It prevented a race to the bottom and put a floor on that, and I think that was a good thing.
When we were in power in 1997, we came in with a majority of 170. We could have done all those things ourselves. We didn't need the European Union to improve our maternity
You could
rights
have,
if the government was elected.
We could have, but we did as a result of being a part of the European
but
Union. It
we
prevented
could
a
have
race to the
done
bottom,
it.
Kate.
We can make our decisions about all those
Well,
things. I'd like to see them improved, actually,
Well,
some
that's
of the
true.
things.
I agree with that. But I mean, as I say, it prevented a race to the bottom. And we were asked about what something that the regulatory framework benefited,
Yeah.
and I think that was one of the benefits.